Welcome to Episode 1 of Rise of a Nation, South America. This episode is on Colombia.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking a journey, a chronological one, through the history of Colombia. It's a story of big shifts, from Spanish colonization right up to the complexities of today. We've got some great historical sources to guide us, so let's dive in.
Okay, so before the Spanish turned up around 1499, the land we now call Colombia wasn't empty. Far from it. It was home to, a whole mosaic of indigenous peoples.
Yoriku.
Groups like the Muisca, the Quimbaya, the Tairona, they were flourishing there. And many had pretty developed ways of farming, mining, even metalworking.
Right. And the Muisca, specifically, I understand their political setup was quite something.
Oh, absolutely. The Muisca Confederation, yeah. It was remarkably sophisticated. You could argue it was second only to the Inca Empire in that part of the Americas. Highly skilled artisans, too. And that famous legend, El Dorado.
The Golden King.
Exactly. That actually started with the Muisca ceremony. Gives you a sense of the wealth, real or imagined, that drew the Europeans in, doesn't it?
It really does. That image of a ruler covered in gold, powerful stuff. So the Spanish arrive, and their focus is pretty clear from the start.
Yeah, their initial goal was, let's be honest, resource extraction. Finding wealth, gold, silver, emeralds, and shipping it back to Spain. That was priority number one.
Okay. And geographically, where did they set up shop first?
They mainly concentrated on the Caribbean coast. Think Cartagena, Santa Marta. The seas there are calmer, and crucially, there were good natural harbors. Made it much easier to build ports and manage the shipping routes back to Europe.
Makes sense. Practicalities. What about the Pacific coast, then? It's a huge coastline.
It is, but it was largely ignored, certainly in the early days.
Yeah.
The conditions were just much tougher. Rough waters, not many good natural harbors, constant heavy rain, and incredibly dense forests. Just really difficult terrain to penetrate and control.
So that early focus on the Caribbean had long-term consequences, I imagine.
Definitely. It shaped settlement patterns, trade routes, regional development for centuries. Anyway, administratively, Spain set up the Viceroyalty of New Granada, and Bogotá became its capital.
Right. And Spain's approach to governing?
Well, under monarchs like Charles III, sometimes called enlightened absolutists, which is a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
They did try to promote Spanish culture, Christianity, that sort of thing. But, and this is key, they kept a very tight grip on political power. No question who was in charge.
Okay, cultural influence but strict control. What about the economy? Were the colonies free to trade?
Not really, no. That was a major point of friction. The colonies faced pretty heavy trade restrictions. They were basically only allowed to trade with Spain itself.
And Spain couldn't always provide everything the colonies needed.
Exactly. Spain often struggled to meet the demand for goods, which created shortages and, resentment. It felt limiting.
I can see how that would build frustration. And it wasn't just trade, right? Politics played a big part, too.
Oh, absolutely. Take Charles III's support for the American Revolution. Good for the U.S., maybe? But it meant new taxes were slapped on the Spanish colonies to pay for it. That directly led to unrest, like the revolt of the Comuneros in New Granada.
The Comuneros. Tell us about them. Who were they?
It was a pretty broad coalition, actually. You had Criollos, people of Spanish descent, born in the Americas, mestizos, even some indigenous people, all protesting these new taxes and other Spanish policies. A really significant early sign of discontent.
And beyond taxes, there was this issue of who got the top jobs.
Yes, a huge issue. The Criollos were systematically shut out of the highest positions in the administration. Even if they were wealthy, educated, and Spanish by blood, being born in the Americas made them second class in the eyes of the crown, essentially.
That must have stung.
Deeply. And then Charles IV comes along, seems less interested in the colonies, leaves things to his ministers. It just felt like neglect and mismanagement to many over here. So all these tensions, economic, political, social, are just simmering beneath the surface.
Right, a powder keg waiting for a spark. What finally lit the fuse for independence?
The big one was the crisis in Spain itself in 1808. Napoleon marches in, forces King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII to abdicate, and puts his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne.
Whoa. That's a massive disruption back in Europe. How did that play out across the Atlantic?
Well, Joseph Bonaparte wasn't popular in Spain. The Spanish fought fiercely against him. But in the Americas, it created this huge power vacuum. Suddenly, the legitimacy of Spanish rule was completely up in the air. If the real king was gone, who were they loyal to? It poured fuel on those existing desires for more autonomy and eventually full independence.
The foundation just crumbled. So what happened immediately in the colonies?
Across Spanish America, you saw the formation of juntas, these local governing councils. But they weren't all on the same page. You had different factions emerge. Centralists wanting a strong central government, Federalists pushing for more regional power, and of course Royalists still loyal to the Spanish crown, or at least the idea of it.
And in New Granada, specifically Bogota, what was the moment?
July 20th, 1810. That's the date they formed. The first independent junta in Santa Fe de Bogota. It's Colombia's Independence Day now. And the trigger event, famously, is the flower vase incident.
Okay, a flower vase. This sounds almost comical. What happened?
It kind of was, but also very calculated. On that morning, some Criollo leaders asked a Spanish shopkeeper, Jose Gonzalez Llorente, to borrow a fancy vase. They said it was to decorate for a dinner, welcoming another Criollo official, Antonio Villavicencio.
And Llorente said no.
He refused, apparently quite rudely, making some disparaging comments about the Criollos. Whether he was provoked or just being difficult, we don't know for sure, but his refusal was the key.
So it wasn't really about the vase itself.
Not at all. It was the perfect pretext. Figures like Francisco José de Caldas immediately used Llorente's insults to whip up the crowd that was already gathered. It was basically street theater designed to spark an uprising against the Spanish viceroy.
And it worked.
It absolutely did. News spread, and similar movements popped up in Cartagena, Cali, Socorro, Pamplona, rejecting Spanish authority. But what followed wasn't exactly smooth sailing. The period from 1810 to about 1815 is known as La Patria Boba.
The foolish fatherland. Doesn't sound very promising.
No, it wasn't. It was characterized by, well, chaos. The newly independent regions just couldn't agree on how to govern themselves. The Centralists and Federalists were at loggerheads, to the point of actual civil war between them. You ended up with two separate states, the Federalist Republic and the Centralist state based in Cundinamarca, fighting each other.
So they're fighting amongst themselves while Spain.
Exactly. Spain saw its chance. This internal division made it much easier for them to launch a reconquest. By 1815, Spanish forces had regained control over much of New Granada.
A serious blow. But the fight wasn't over.
Not by a long shot. The struggle continued. The next phase is known as the Liberation of New Granada, roughly 1819 to 1824. There were crucial battles. Cartagena was finally taken back by the Patriots in 1821, and the southern provinces, what's now Ecuador, were liberated too. It was a long, hard fight.
And out of this extended war, the idea of a larger, unified state emerged. Gran Colombia.
Precisely. Simón Bolívar, the key independence leader, had this vision. Gran Colombia was proclaimed in 1819 at the Congress of Angostura, and it really took shape with the Constitution of Cúcuta in 1821.
And what areas did it actually cover? It was huge, wasn't it?
It was massive. It brought together the territories of former New Granada, Venezuela, Panama, and Quito, so modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. For a time, it was a seriously significant nation on the map.
How was it structured initially? Centralized, federal?
Well, the initial idea leaned more federal, with three big departments: Cundinamarca, Venezuela, Quito, each with its own VP. But the 1821 Constitution shifted towards a more unitary centralist state. Bogota became the single capital. Bolívar was president, and Francisco de Paula Santander was vice president.
Interesting. Why the shift to centralism after all that earlier fighting between Federalists and Centralists?
The thinking for many was that a strong central government was needed to win the war definitively and hold the new nation together, sort of a wartime necessity. They even subdivided the territory further in 1824 into smaller departments run by centrally appointed officials to strengthen Bogota's control.
But those old tensions didn't just disappear, did they, between Bolívar and Santander?
Not at all. That began the defining struggle within Gran Colombia. Bolívar pushed for a strong, almost authoritarian presidency, believing it necessary for stability. Santander, on the other hand, championed federalism, constitutional limits on power, rule of law. Two giants of independence, now with very different visions for the future.
And how did the rest of the world view this new mega-republic?
Recognition was tricky. European powers were still mostly monarchies, and weren't exactly thrilled about large, powerful republics emerging in the Americas. Plus, there were border disputes, so it faced external pressures as well as internal ones.
Sounds like a recipe for instability. What were the final straws that led to its breakup?
Internal conflicts were key. Regional feelings were very strong. Venezuela nearly broke away in 1826 with a movement called La Cociata, led by José Antonio Páez. Then there was a war with Peru over territory from 1828 to 1829. Ultimately, the deep political divisions, especially between Bolívar's and Santander's factions, and these strong regional pulls just couldn't be overcome. Gran Colombia dissolved in 1831.
Only lasted about a decade then. A grand experiment, but short-lived. So what happened to the part that's now Colombia?
After the split, it became the Republic of New Granada, which at that point still included Panama. And then, honestly, the rest of the 19th century saw a lot of political turbulence and name changes. It was the Granadine Confederation for a bit, then the United States of Colombia.
United States of Colombia?
Yeah, they really experimented with federalism
Mhm.
before finally settling on the Republic of Colombia in 1886, which is the name that stuck.
And throughout this period, those political fault lines from the Gran Colombia era persisted, the conservative-liberal divide.
Absolutely dominated Colombian politics. You can trace the conservatives back to Bolivar's followers, favoring strong central government, close ties with the Catholic Church, limited voting rights, and the liberals back to Santander's side, wanting more decentralization, separation of church and state, broader suffrage.
And this wasn't just polite debate, was it? It often turned violent.
Tragically, yes. Colombia's history is marked by recurring, incredibly violent civil wars between these two parties. The Thousand Days' War at the turn of the 20th century was devastating, and then La Violencia in the mid-20th century. Just brutal conflict, especially in the countryside, sparked by political polarization.
And somewhere in there, Colombia lost Panama.
Yes, in 1903, Panama seceded. U.S. interests in building the Panama Canal were, shall we say, a major influencing factor there. Colombia had hesitated on the terms the U.S. offered.
Okay, so internal conflict, loss of territory. What about the 20th century? Military rule, guerrillas.
Yeah, Colombia had military coups 1830, 1854, and then a longer period under General Rojas Pinilla from 1953 to 57, though the earlier ones saw civilian rule restored relatively fast. Then, to try and stop the endless liberal conservative violence, they created the National Front.
What was that?
From 1958 to 1974, the liberals and conservatives agreed to alternate the presidency and share power in government, a unique power-sharing deal.
Did it work? Did it bring peace?
It reduced the fighting between the two main parties, yes. But some felt it just excluded other political voices. And it was during this period, or shortly after, that you see the rise of left-wing guerrilla movements. FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, formed in '64, rooted in rural demands for land reform with a communist ideology. And M19 emerged later, partly in response to claims of election fraud in 1970.
So the nature of the conflict shifted, and then came the drug trade.
Yeah, the rise of the illegal drug trade in the 70s and especially the 80s with cartels like Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. It just poured gasoline on the fire. It funded violence on all sides, corrupted institutions, led to horrific levels of violence, especially around the issue of extraditing traffickers to the U.S. It became deeply entangled with the political conflict.
An incredibly complex and violent mix. Were there serious attempts at peace during all this?
There were many attempts, ceasefires, talks. Often they broke down. But there were successes, too. In the late 80s, early 90s, some groups, like M19, did demobilize and join mainstream politics. And a new constitution in 1991 brought major reforms, trying to address some root causes of conflict, promote human rights, decentralize power.
But FARC remained the largest guerrilla group, a major challenge for decades.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They remained a powerful force well into the 21st century. There were periods of intense conflict, periods of talks that failed. Under President Uribe in the 2000s, there was a major military push against them. Security improved in some areas. The economy showed some positive signs, too. But that period also saw significant human rights controversies.
Which brings us more recently to the peace process with FARC under President Santos.
Exactly. President Santos staked his presidency on achieving peace with FARC. It was a long, difficult negotiation held mostly in Havana. They finally reached an agreement in 2016.
But the Colombian people initially rejected it in a referendum, right?
They did, narrowly. It was a shock. But Santos and FARC quickly renegotiated some aspects, and a revised deal was then approved by the Colombian Congress later that year. Santos won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And crucially, work began on reparations for the millions of victims of the conflict.
So a historic achievement ending over 50 years of war with FARC. But implementation is still ongoing.
Very much so. Implementing the accords, things like rural development, justice for victims, reintegrating ex-combatants, tackling the remaining armed groups, and drug trafficking, it's a huge ongoing challenge. The political landscape remains complex too, with President Duque taking a more critical stance on parts of the deal and relations with Venezuela fluctuating.
What an incredible, sweeping history. We've gone from indigenous societies and Spanish colonization through independence, the grand vision and collapse of Gran Colombia, the century of liberal-conservative conflict, the rise of guerrillas and cartels, and finally to this fragile but hopeful peace process.
It really highlights the deep roots of Colombia's challenges, but also its resilience.
Yeah.
The constant push and pull between different visions for the country, the legacy of violence, but also this persistent search for peace and stability.
It certainly does. It really underscores how history isn't just past events, it actively shapes the present and future. Thank you for guiding us through that complex story.
My pleasure. It's a history with, I think, a lot to teach us about conflict, reconciliation, and the sheer difficulty of building a lasting peace.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you, our listeners. Thinking about Colombia's long history of conflict, the divisions, but also this major step towards peace with the FARC agreement. What do you think are the biggest hurdles remaining, and maybe the biggest opportunities for Colombia to achieve real, lasting stability and progress moving forward? Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thank you for watching Episode 1 of Rise of a Nation, South America. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for more. Write in the comments what country's rise you would like me to cover next.